Hello. Hello, Sharkies. Jumping into chat before I even opened up the camera. How's it going? Happy Friday. Is my audio coming through? It looks to me like it is. Look at that puppy. Oh, wagging his tail. Hello, puppy. Hello. He wants a treat. I can tell. You've got bacon and pancakes for dinner. Baking pancakes, making bacon pancakes. Cook some bacon and you put it in a pancake. Bacon pancakes, that's what it's gonna be. Bacon pancakes! Yeah, Farmos likes breakfast for dinner. I generally don't. I don't know why. It's wrong. I'm not gonna, like say you shouldn't be doing it. It's wrong for me. It's not wrong for everybody. And I saw Robot Kyo in the chat list. Also, Abbott Costello. I don't know who Abbott Costello is. I mean, I know who Abbott and Costello are, but I don't know who username Abbott Costello is. Oh, I went out of focus. Leaned forward and then leaned back, and camera didn't like that. Now Farmos wants pancakes. Okay, come on. Come on, pay attention, camera. What are you doing? I'm back here. There we go. It's weird that that works. Decided to shift the lighting to a little bit more green to fit with the forest that we've been sitting in Vowasoon, the ruins of Vowasoon. Look at that guy. So a little bit of a slow start to this book. Introducing some new characters and some new information. We've got Lelldorin. And Hetar has joined up. But as of chapter 3, I think we'll probably start to be on the move again. Robot Kyo's here. Hello. I thought I saw you in the list. By which I mean I know I saw you in the list, but I didn't know whether that meant you were actually here or not. How's it going? I don't know if you have been listening at all on to the recorded chapters. It's been horribly busy. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry about the horrible side of that. Obviously, we're probably a little further ahead in the story than you are, so there will likely be some spoilers. But you're welcome to hang out anyways, as long as you don't mind. Yeah, so where last we left our Farmos had some, lag or something? Okay. You're okay with it? Makes you want to go back and reread it yourself at some point? That's fair. Yeah, where last we left our intrepid heroes. I'm not entirely certain in which way they would be intrepid. I don't know. I have a vague sense of what the word intrepid means, but I guess I don't know the exact dictionary definition of it. I just know that it goes before the word heroes. Do I have something over here? Saw something. Looked like something was in my hair, but it might have just been the light. Yeah, where last we left them, Garion has made a friend. And Garion doesn't necessarily think that his friend is maybe absolutely the brightest person in the world, which, but Robot Kyo also isn't certain about the definition, and the Sharkies think they only hear it in cliches. Yeah, Garion's made a friend in Lelldorin, the um, he's an errand. I want to say an Asturian. Yeah, he's an Asturian errand, who is apparently a very fine archer, but also very emotional and brash and Sharky say, "You're here and you're mostly my age. Been in that situation before." Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of the like apparently Lelldorin is going to be joining their group and is definitely the closest to Garion's age in that regard. So even if Garion doesn't necessarily agree with everything that Lelldorin is saying, ah, Farmo says that intrepid just means fearless and adventurous. Well, in that case, I don't know. I mean, they're not fearless, though. As that last conversation we had with Silk, they're going to act like maybe they are. They just went over this. I think that was how we finished the last chapter. Are you afraid too, Silk? Garion asked. Silk sighed. Yes, he admitted, but we can behave as if we believed that we aren't, can't we? So, maybe they're acting intrepid even if they aren't necessarily. Sharkies feel like apart from archery skills that are common among his people, we don't know yet why he's useful to this party. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, that said, you say archery skills that are common among his people, but I believe they were saying that he is maybe somewhat more than common in archery ability. Let me see if I can find the bit. I mean, Lelldorin did seem to kind of just say, like, Garion was like, "You're awfully good," and he was like, "I'm an Asturian." But let's see, because I believe Mr. Wolf said something about it. Ah, uh, he's not as frivolous as all that, not quite anyway. He's the best bowman in Asturia, and we might need his skill before we're done with all this. And then Mr. Wolf also said, "There's another reason, of course, but I don't think we need to get into that just now." And then they talked a little bit about the Mrin Codex and how obscure it is. Um, yeah, I mean, whether or not that's 100% accurate, because Mr. Wolf does exaggerate sometimes, but what we have been told is that he is the best bowman in Asturia, which may or may not equate to best bowman in the world. Yeah. All right. Well, what do you say? I think I kind of just want to get into it. I want to see where this is going to go, don't you? So let's start chapter 3 on page 32 in my edition. Sharky say, Mr. Wolf exaggerates but doesn't seem to lavish undue praise. That's true. And considering he didn't seem very impressed with Lelldorin when he gave that introduction, what with the sword fighting, um, you know, if he's saying it then, it probably is true. I may have made this a little strong. Having some of the it's pomegranate and I forget. All right. Chapter 3. The next morning, Silk came out of the tower wearing a rich maroon doublet and a bag-like black velvet cap cocked jauntily over one ear. "What's all that about?" Aunt Pole asked him. "I chanced across an old friend in one of the packs," Silk replied airily. "Radek of Boktor by name." "What happened to Ambar of Kotu?" "Ambar's a good enough fellow, I suppose," Silk said a bit deprecatingly. "But a Murgo named Asherak knows about him and may have dropped his name in certain quarters. Let's not look for trouble if we don't have to." "Not a bad disguise," Mr. Wolf agreed. "One more Draznian merchant on the Great West Road won't attract any attention, whatever his name." "Please," Silk objected in an injured tone. "The name's very important. You hang the whole disguise on the name." "I don't see any difference," Barak asserted bluntly. "There's all the difference in the world. Surely you can see that Ambar's a vagabond with very little regard for ethics, while Radek's a man of substance, whose word is good in all the commercial centers of the West. Besides, Radek's always accompanied by servants." "Servants?" One of Aunt Pole's eyebrows shot up. "Just for the sake of the disguise," Silk assured her quickly. "You, of course, could never be a servant, Lady Polgara." Spoiler warning. "Thank you." "No one would ever believe it. You'll be my sister instead, traveling with me to see the splendors of Tolhoneth." "Your sister?" "You could be my mother instead, if you prefer," Silk suggested blandly, "making a religious pilgrimage to Marterin to atone for a colorful past." Aunt Pole gazed steadily at the small man for a moment while he grinned impudently at her. "Someday your sense of humor is going to get you into a great deal of trouble, Prince Keldar." "I'm always in trouble, Lady Polgara. I wouldn't know how to act if I weren't." Farmer says, "Oh, yes. We totally see that, Silk. Yeah. Ambar and Radek, very different from one another."
"Do you two suppose we could get started?"
Mr. Wolf asked. "Just a moment more," Silk replied. "If we meet anyone and have to explain things, you, Lelldorin, and Garion are Polgara's servants. Oh, sorry. You, to Mr. Wolf, Lelldorin, and Garion, are Polgara's servants. Hatar, Barak, and Dernik are mine."
"Anything you say,"
Wolf agreed wearily. "There are reasons."
"All right."
"Don't you want to hear them?"
"Not particularly."
Silk looked a bit hurt. I love that. He's like, "Come on, ask me why."
"Are we ready?"
Wolf asked. "Everything's out of the tower." Oh, what was that? That was Swedish. Dernik became Swedish for a moment, I'm sorry. Farmer says, "But it's so clever. I spent so much time." "Oh, very well." Sharky say, "But I've come up with a 3-page backstory." Yeah. Let me try that again. "Everything's out of the tower," Dernik told him. "Oh, Just a moment. I forgot to put the fire up. Put out the fire. He went back inside. Wolf glanced after the smith in exasperation.
What difference does it make? He muttered. This place is a ruin anyway.
Leave him alone, father, Aunt Pole said placidly. It's the way he is. As they prepared to mount, Barak's horse, a large, sturdy gray, sighed and threw a reproachful look at Hetar, and the Algar chuckled.
What's so funny?
Barak demanded suspiciously. The horse said something, Hetar replied. Never mind. Oh boy. Lily's here. Hello, Lily. So, Lily, just as a little something to mention to you, we had sent you back in December a Christmas card, and we very recently received it back in the mail. Apparently, the address on it was slightly incorrect. Oh, Farmos told you. Okay, all right. Just so long as you're aware. So yeah, that's that may you may be getting a very late Christmas card. I'm sorry it didn't arrive sooner. Farmos had a problem with the 3-page backstory for her most recent D&D character. It was supposed to be no more than 1,500 words. Yeah, how about that? Chucky say, one of my characters, I even figured out how she signs her name in Elvish. That's a little bit extra, I think, as the kids would say. All right. Lily, you're just joining us near the beginning of Chapter 3 of Queen of Sorcery. On Wednesday, we went through 1 and 2. So, Barak's horse is apparently cracking jokes to Hetar about needing to carry Barak. Then they swung into their saddles and threaded their way out of the foggy ruins and along the narrow, muddy track that wound into the forest. Sodden snow lay under wet trees, and water dripped continually from the branches overhead. They all drew their cloaks about them to ward off the chill and dampness. Once they were under the trees, Lelldorin pulled his horse in beside Garion's, and they rode together. Is Prince Keldar always so, well, extremely complicated? He asked. Silk? Oh, yes. He's very devious. You see, he's a spy, and disguises and clever lies are all second nature to him. A spy? Really? Lelldorin's eyes brightened as his imagination caught hold of the idea. He works for his uncle, the king of Drasnia, Garion explained. Garion's the one in the know now. All of a sudden, Lelldorin is the newbie who's got to learn everything from, the beginning. He works for his uncle, the king of Drasnia, Garion explained. From what I understand, the Drasnians have been at this sort of thing for centuries. We've got to stop and pick up the rest of the packs, Silk was reminding Mr. Wolf.
I haven't forgotten,
the old man replied. Packs? Lelldorin asked. Silk picked up some wool cloth in Kamar, Garion told him. He said it would give us a legitimate reason to be on the highway. We hid them in a cave when we left the road to come to Voasun. He thinks of everything, doesn't he? He tries. We're lucky to have him with us. Maybe we could have him show us a few things about disguises, Lelldorin suggested brightly. It might be very useful when we go looking for your enemy. Garion had thought that Lelldorin had forgotten his impulsive pledge. The young errand's mind seemed too flighty to keep hold of one idea for very long, but he saw now that Lelldorin only seemed to forget things. The prospect of a serious search for his parents' murderer, with this young enthusiast adding embellishments and improvisations at every turn, began to present itself alarmingly. By mid-morning, after they had picked up Silk's packs and lashed them to the backs of the spare horses, they were back out on the Great West Road, the Tolnedron Highway running through the heart of the forest. They rode south at a loping canter that ate up the miles. They passed a heavily burdened serf, clothed in scraps and pieces of sackcloth tied on with bits of string. The serf's face was gaunt, and he was very thin under his dirty rags. He stepped off the road and stared at them with apprehension until they had passed. Garion felt a sudden stab of compassion. He briefly remembered Lammer and Detton, and he wondered what would finally happen to them. It seemed important for some reason. Is it really necessary to keep them so poor? He demanded of Lelldorin, unable to hold it in any longer. Who? Lelldorin asked, looking around. That serf. Lelldorin glanced back over his shoulder at the ragged man. You didn't even see him, Garion accused. Lelldorin shrugged. There are so many. And they all dress in rags and live on the edge of starvation. Mimbrate taxes, Lelldorin replied, as if that explained everything. You seem to have always enough to eat. I'm not a serf, Garion, Lelldorin answered patiently. The poorest people always suffer the most. It's the way the world is. It doesn't have to be, Garion retorted. You just don't understand. No, and I never will. Naturally not, Lelldorin said with infuriating complacency. You're not Arendish. Garion clenched his teeth to hold back the obvious reply. By late afternoon, they had covered 10 leagues, and the snow had largely disappeared from the roadside. Shouldn't we start to give some thought to where we're going to spend the night, Father? Aunt Pole suggested. Mr. Wolf scratched thoughtfully at his beard as he squinted at the shadows hovering in the trees around them. I have an uncle who lives not far from here, Lelldorin offered. Count Reldigan. I'm sure he'll be glad to give us shelter.
Thin? Mr. Wolf asked. Dark hair?
It's gray now, Lelldorin replied. Do you know him?
I haven't seen him for 20 years, Wolf told him. As I recall, he used to be quite a hothead.
Uncle Reldigan? You must have him confused with somebody else, Belgarath.
Maybe, Wolf said. How far is it to his house?
No more than 1.5 leagues away.
Let's go see him, Wolf decided.
Parmo says, oh boy, Garion gonna make this boy into a communist yet? That's quite the stretch. Sharkies were just thinking Lelldorin's reasoning is, but capitalism. But aristocracy. Lelldorin shook his reins and moved into the lead to show them the way. How are you and your friend getting along? Silk asked, falling in beside Garion. Fine, I suppose, Garion replied, not quite sure how the rat-faced little man intended the question. It seems to be a little hard to explain things to him, though. That's only natural, Silk observed. He's an errand, after all. Garion quickly came to Lelldorin's defense. He's honest and very brave. They all are. That's part of the problem. I like him, Garion asserted. So do I, Garion, but that doesn't keep me from realizing the truth about him. If you're trying to say something, why don't you just go ahead and say it? All right, I will. Don't let friendship get the better of your good sense. Arendia's a very dangerous place, and errands tend to blunder into disasters quite regularly. Don't let your exuberant young companion drag you into something that's none of your business. Silk's look was direct, and Garion realized that the little man was quite serious. I'll be careful, he promised. I knew I could count on you, Silk said gravely. Are you making fun of me? Would I do that, Garion? Silk asked mockingly. Then he laughed, and they rode on together through the gloomy afternoon. The gray stone house of Count Reldigan was about a mile back in the forest from the highway, and it stood in the center of a clearing that extended beyond bowshot in every direction. Interesting. Although it had no wall, it had somehow the look of a fort. The windows facing out were narrow and covered with iron gratings. Strong turrets, surmounted by battlements, stood at each corner, and the gate which opened into the central courtyard of the house was made of whole tree trunks, squared off and strapped together with iron bands. Garion stared at the brooding pile as they approached in the rapidly fading light. There was a kind of haughty ugliness about the house, a grim solidity that seemed to defy the world. Sharky say reminds me more of a prison than a fort. It's not a very pleasant-looking sort of place, is it? He said to Silk. Asturian architecture's a reflection of their society, Silk replied. A strong house isn't a bad idea in a country where neighborhood disputes sometimes get out of hand. Are they all so afraid of each other? Just cautious, Garion, just cautious. Lelldorin dismounted before the heavy gate and spoke to someone on the other side through a small grill. There was finally a rattling of chains and the grinding sound of heavy, iron-shod bars sliding back. I wouldn't make any quick moves once we're inside, Silk advised quietly. There'll probably be archers watching us. Garion looked at him sharply. A quaint custom of the region, Silk informed him. Farmo says, Angst house. They rode into a cobblestoned courtyard and dismounted. Count Reldigan, when he appeared, was a tall, thin man with iron-gray hair and beard, who walked with the aid of a stout cane. He wore a rich green doublet and black hose. Despite the fact that he was in his own house, he carried a sword at his side. He limped heavily down a broad flight of stairs from the house to greet them. Uncle, Lelldorin said, bowing respectfully. Nephew, the Count replied in polite acknowledgement. My friends and I found ourselves in the vicinity, Lelldorin stated, and we thought we might impose on you for the night. You're always welcome, nephew, Reldigan answered with a kind of grave formality. Have you dined yet? No, uncle. Then you must all take supper with me. May I know your friends? Mr. Wolf, pushed back his hood and stepped forward.
"You and I are already acquainted, Reldigan," he said.
The Count's eyes widened.
"Belgarath, is it really you?"
Wolf grinned.
"Oh, yes. I'm still wandering about the world, stirring up mischief."
Reldigan laughed then, and grasped Wolf's upper arm warmly.
"Come inside, all of you. Let's not stand about in the cold."
He turned and limped up the steps to the house.
"What happened to your leg?"
Wolf asked him, straight to the point. Oh,
"An arrow in the knee."
somebody gonna say it? Somebody's gonna say it, right? Robacchio says, "The origin." The Count shrugged.
"The result of an old disagreement, long since forgotten. As I recall, you used to get involved in quite a few of those. I thought for a while that you intended to go through life with your sword half drawn."
Sharky say, "Used to be an adventurer."
"I was an excitable youth,"
the Count admitted, opening the broad door at the top of the steps. He led them down a long hallway to a room of imposing size, with a large blazing fireplace at each end. Great curving stone arches supported the ceiling. The floor was of polished black stone, scattered with fur rugs, and the walls, arches, and ceiling were whitewashed in gleaming contrast. Heavy, carved chairs of dark brown wood sat here and there, and a great table with an iron candelabra in its center stood near the fireplace at one end. A dozen or so leather-bound books were scattered on its polished surface.
"Books, Reldigan?"
Mr. Wolf said in amazement as he and the others removed their cloaks and gave them to the servants, who immediately appeared.
"You have mellowed, my friend."
The Count smiled at the old man's remark.
"I'm forgetting my manners,"
Wolf apologized.
"My daughter, Polgara. Pol, this is Count Reldigan, an old friend."
"My lady," the Count acknowledged with an exquisite bow.
"My house is honored."
Aunt Pol was about to reply when two young men burst into the room, arguing heatedly. "You're an idiot, Barentane!" The first, a dark-haired youth in a scarlet doublet, snapped. "It may please thee to think so, Torreson," the second, a stout young man with pale curly hair and wearing a green and yellow striped tunic, replied. "But whether it please thee or not, Asturia's future is in Mimbrate hands. Thy rancorous denouncements and sulphurous rhetoric shall not alter that fact." Shakespeare? I'm not familiar with Shakespeare. They sound like surfers. Yeah. We'll talk about that later. "Don't thee or thou me, Barentane," the dark-haired one sneered. "Your imitation Mimbrate courtesy turns my stomach." It's getting thicker, isn't it? I can't help it now. That's just how they are.
"Gentlemen, that's enough,"
Count Reldigan said sharply, rapping his cane on the stone floor.
"If you two are going to insist on discussing politics, I'll have you separated, forcibly if necessary."
The two young men scowled at each other and then stalked off to opposite sides of the room.
"My son, Torreson,"
the Count admitted apologetically, indicating the dark-haired youth,
"and his cousin Barentane, the son of my late wife's brother. They've been wrangling like this for 2 weeks now. I had to take their swords away from the day after Barentane arrived.
Political discussion is good for the blood, my lord, Silk observed, especially in the winter. The heat keeps the veins from clogging up. The Count chuckled at the little man's remark.
Prince Keldar of the royal house of Drasnia,
Mr. Wolf introduced Silk.
Your Highness,
the Count responded, bowing. Silk winced slightly. Please, my lord, I've spent a lifetime running from that mode of address, and I'm sure that my connection with the royal family embarrasses my uncle almost as much as it embarrasses me. The Count laughed again with easy good nature. Why don't we all adjourn to the dining table? He suggested. 2 fat deer have been turning on spits in my kitchen since daybreak, and I recently obtained a cask of red wine from southern Tolnidra. As I recall, Belgarath has always had a great fondness for good food and good wines. He hasn't changed, my lord, Aunt Pole told him. My father's terribly predictable, once you get to know him. The Count smiled and offered her his arm as they all moved toward the door on the far side of the room. Tell me, my lord, Aunt Pole said, do you, by chance, have a bathtub in your house? Speaking of predictable. Bathing in winter is dangerous, Lady Polgara, the Count warned her. How about that? That's an interesting statement. My lord, she stated gravely, I've been bathing winter or summer for more years than you could possibly imagine.
Let her bathe, Reldigan, Mr. Wolf urged. Her temper deteriorates quite noticeably when she thinks she's getting dirty.
A bath wouldn't hurt you either, old wolf, Aunt Pole retorted tartly. You're starting to get a bit strong from the downwind side. Mr. Wolf looked a bit injured. Much later, after they had eaten their fill of venison, gravy-soaked bread, and rich cherry tarts, wow, sounds like quite the meal. Aunt Pole excused herself and went with a maidservant to oversee the preparation of her bath. Farmos gets it. Cold and clean, sure. Reasonable temperature and dirty, maybe. But cold and dirty? No. Sharkies want that meal? Venison, gravy-soaked bread, and rich cherry tarts? Yeah, I could go for that. I'm like, I have to have dinner after this, so I'm feeling a little hungry, and that description, yeah, it's reminding me. The men all lingered at the table over their wine cups, their faces washed with the golden light of the many candles in Reldigan's dining hall. Let me show you to your rooms, Torsen suggested to Lelldorin and Garion, pushing back his chair and casting a look of veiled contempt across the table at Barentane. They followed him from the room and up a long flight of stairs toward the upper stories of the house. I don't want to offend you, Tor, Lelldorin said as they climbed, but your cousin has some peculiar ideas. I feel like I'm getting them mixed up. I thought Torsen was the one theeing and thouing, but was it the other way around? Don't thee or thou me, Barentane. Okay, Barentane was the one theeing and thouing. Alright, let me see if I can remember what the other one sounded like then. Torsen snorted. Barentane's a jackass. He thinks he can impress the Mimbrates by imitating their speech and by fawning on them. His dark face was angry in the light of the candle he carried to light their way. Why should he want to? Lelldorin asked. He's desperate for some kind of holding he can call his own, Torreson replied. My mother's brother has very little land to leave him. The fat idiot's all calf-eyed over the daughter of one of the barons in his district, and since the baron won't even consider a landless suitor, Barantain's trying to wheedle an estate from the Mimbrate governor. He'd swear fealty to the ghost of Kaltorak himself if he thought it would get him land. Doesn't he realize that he hasn't got a chance? Lelldorin inquired. There are too many land-hungry Mimbrate knights around the governor for him to even think of granting an estate to an Asturian. I've told him the same thing myself, Torreson declared with scathing contempt. But there's no reasoning with him. His behavior degrades our whole family. Well, okay, this is Torreson and Lelldorin talking to each other, and they're cousins. So they haven't just met. They know each other. Because Lelldorin's the one that brought them to his uncle Reldigan's house, and Torreson, I believe, is... Let me make sure I'm still not getting that mixed up. Yeah, Torreson is Reldigan's son, so that would make Lelldorin and Torreson cousins, I think. In response to the Sharkies, hi, we just met, but here's all our family gossip. Lelldorin's part of the family. Speaking of, his behavior degrades our whole family. Lelldorin shook his head commiseratingly as they reached an upper hall. He looked around quickly then. I have to talk with you, Tor, he blurted, his voice dropping to a whisper. Torreson looked at him sharply. My fathers committed me to Belgarath's service in a matter of great importance, Lelldorin hurried on in that same hushed voice. I don't know how long we'll be gone, so you and the others will have to kill Korodullin without me. Well, just out with it. Torreson's eyes went wide with horror. We're not alone, Lelldorin, he said in a strangled voice. I'll go down to the other end of the hall, Garion said quickly. No, Lelldorin replied firmly, taking hold of Garion's arm. Garion's my friend, Tor. I have no secrets from him. Lelldorin, please, Garion protested. I'm not an Asturian. I'm not even an errand. I don't want to know what you're planning. But you will know, Garion, as proof of my trust in you, Lelldorin declared. Next summer, when Korodullin, I'm thinking it's pronounced Dullin because Arendia is kind of a, like, Western European sort of seeming place to me. Like, I feel like it's got a lot of British influences. So I'm thinking it's Korodullin and not like Korodullin or something like that. Next summer, when Korodullin journeys to the ruined city of Vo Astur to hold court there for the 6 weeks that maintain the fiction of Arendish unity, we are going to ambush him on the highway. Lelldorin, Torreson gasped, his face turning white. Did I hear a laugh? Was that a funny Lelldorin? But Lelldorin was already plunging on. He's so naive. I see. It won't be just a simple ambush, Garion. This will be a masterstroke at Mimbrae's heart. We are going to ambush him in the uniforms of Tolnedran legionnaires and cut him down with Tolnedran swords. Our attack will force Mimbrae to declare war on the Tolnedran Empire, and Tolnedra
will crush Mimbre like an eggshell. Mimbre will be destroyed, and Asturia will be free. Natchak will have you killed for this, Lelldorin, Torreson cried. We've all been sworn to secrecy on a blood oath. Tell the Murgo that I spit on his oath, Lelldorin said hotly.
The Murgo Natchak, huh? Curious.
What need have Asturian patriots for a Murgo henchman? He's providing us with gold, you blockhead, Torreson raged, almost beside himself. We need his good red gold to buy the uniforms, the swords, and to strengthen the backbones of some of our weaker friends. I don't need weaklings with me, Lelldorin said intensely. A patriot does what he does for the love of his country, not for Angarak gold.
Garion's mind was moving quickly now. Like Farmo says, we all know about how Murgo red gold corrupts. We've got some experience with that. Garion has some experience with that. Garion's mind was moving quickly now. His moment of stunned amazement had passed. There was a man in Cherek, he recalled, the Earl of Yarvik. He also took Murgo gold and plotted to kill a king. The two stared at him blankly. Something happens to a country when you kill its king, Garion explained. No matter how bad the king is, or how good the people are who kill him, the country falls apart for a while. Everything is confused, and there's nobody to point the country in any one direction. Then, if you start a war between that country and another one at the same time, you add just that much more confusion. I think that if I were a Murgo, that's exactly the kind of confusion I'd want to see in all the kingdoms of the West. Garion listened to his own voice, almost in amazement. There was a dry, dispassionate quality in it that he instantly recognized. From the time of his earliest memories, that voice had always been there, inside his mind, occupying some quiet, hidden corner, telling him when he was wrong or foolish. But the voice had never actively interfered before in his dealings with other people. Now, however, it spoke directly to these two young men, patiently explaining. That's interesting. We've heard the dry voice before. Well, we've heard Garion think in a dry, like there being a dry sort of voice in his mind, but it's always kind of sounded like that was just, like talking to yourself, right? This is interesting because it sounds like Garion is almost viewing this voice as a separate entity. But maybe it's just Garion, like a different part of Garion's personality, and he's just, normally he doesn't talk that way to people. Maybe. Angarak gold isn't what it seems to be, he went on. There's a kind of power in it that corrupts you. Maybe that's why it's the color of blood. I'd think about that before I accepted any more red gold from this Murgo Natchak. Why do you suppose he's giving you gold and helping you with this plan of yours? He's not Asturian, so patriotism couldn't have anything to do with it, could it? I'd think about that, too. This is very, reasonable sounding of Garion compared to how he normally... Sometimes, not to say, Garion is sometimes reasonable, but he doesn't usually give big monologues like this that are so thought out. Lelldorin in Sharky's brain is now Marius from Les Mis. I'm very sorry to say I've never actually seen Les Mis. Lelldorin and his cousin
looked suddenly troubled. Maybe Garion's getting through to them. Excuse me. I'm not going to say anything about this to anybody, Garion said. You told me about it in confidence, and I really wasn't supposed to hear about it anyway. But remember that there's a lot more going on in the world right now than what's happening here in Arendia. Now, I think I'd like to get some sleep. If you'll show me where my bed is, I'll leave you to talk things over all night, if you'd like. All in all, Garion thought he'd handled the whole thing rather well. He'd planted a few doubts at the very least. He knew Eddings well enough by now to realize that it probably wouldn't be enough to turn these two around, but it was a start. So he thinks that, to address what I was saying earlier, this was Garion speaking. He thought he'd handled it rather well. It's only 10 to 8, and we have finished Chapter 3. Chapter 4, let's see how long that is before I jump right into it. Chapter 4 goes from page 43 to page 53, so another 10 pages. I think we should just go ahead. Sound good? Yeah. Do it, Sleet. Let's go. Let's read Chapter 4. All right. The following morning, they rode out early, while the mist still hung among the trees. Count Lelldorin, wrapped in a dark cloak, stood at his gate to bid them farewell, and Torison, standing beside his father, seemed unable to take his eyes off Garion's face. Garion kept his expression as blank as possible. The fiery young Asturian seemed to be filled with doubts, and those doubts might keep him from plunging headlong into something disastrous. It wasn't much, Garion realized, but it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. "Come back soon, Belgarath," Lelldorin said. "Sometime when you can stay longer. We're very isolated here, and I'd like to know what the rest of the world's doing. We'll sit by the fire and talk away a month or two." Mr. Wolf nodded gravely. "Maybe when this business of mine is over, Lelldorin." Then he turned his horse and led the way across the wide clearing that surrounded Lelldorin's house and back once again into the gloomy forest. "The Count's an unusual errand," Silk said lightly as they rode along. "I think I actually detected an original thought or two in him last evening." "He's changed a great deal," Wolf agreed. Wow. "He sets a good table," Barak said. "I haven't felt this full since I left Lelldorin." "You should," Aunt Pole told him. "You ate the biggest part of one deer by yourself." "You're exaggerating, Polgara," Barak said. "But not by very much," Hetar observed in his quiet voice. Lelldorin had pulled his horse in beside Garion's, but he had not spoken. His face was as troubled as his cousin's had been. It was obvious that he wanted to say something, and just as obvious that he didn't know how to begin. "Go ahead," Garion said quietly. "We are good enough friends that I'm not going to be upset if it doesn't come out exactly right." That's a good way to approach things, I think. Sometimes people mean to say things one way and don't get the words right, and I think, it's good to be clear that they've got the benefit of the doubt. Lelldorin looked a little sheepish. "Am I really that obvious?" "Honest is a better word for it," Garion told him. "You've just never learned to hide your feelings, that's all." "Was it really true?" Lelldorin blurted. I'm not doubting your word, but was there really a Murgo in Cherrick plotting against King Anheg? Ask Silk, Garion suggested. Or Barak, or Hetar. Any of them. We were all there. Nachak isn't like that, though, Lelldorin said quickly, defensively. Can you be sure? Garion asked him. The plan was his in the first place, wasn't it? How did you happen to meet him? We'd all gone down to the great fair. Torrison, me, several of the others. We bought some things from a Murgo merchant, and Tor made a few remarks about Mimbrates. You know how Tor is. Yeah, you've got so much experience with him. The merchant said that he knew somebody we might be interested in meeting, and he introduced us to Nachak. The more we talked with him, the more sympathetic he seemed to become to the way we felt. Naturally. He told us what the king is planning. You wouldn't believe it. Probably not. Lelldorin gave him a quick, troubled look. He's going to break up our estates and give them to landless Mimbrate nobles. He said it accusingly. Did you verify that with anybody but Nachak? How could we? The Mimbrates wouldn't admit it if we confronted them with it, but it's the kind of thing Mimbrates would do. So, you've only got Nachak's word for it. How did this plan of yours come up? Nachak said that if he were an Asturian, he wouldn't let anybody take his land, but he said that it would be too late to try to stop them when they came with knights and soldiers. He said that if he were doing it, he'd strike before they were ready, and that he'd do it in such a way that the Mimbrates wouldn't know who'd done it. That's when he suggested the Tolnedran uniforms. When did he start giving you money? I'm not sure. Tor handled that part of it. Did he ever say why he was giving you money? He said it was out of friendship. Didn't that seem a little odd? I'd give someone money out of friendship, Lelldorin protested. Sharky say, always fact check your sources, Lelldorin. You're an Asturian, Garion told him. You'd give somebody your life out of friendship. Nachak's a Murgo, though, and I've never heard that they were all that generous. What it comes down to, then, is that a stranger tells you that the king's planning to take your land. Then he gives you a plan to kill the king and start a war with Tolnedra. And to make sure you succeed with his plan, he gives you money. Is that about it? Lelldorin nodded mutely, his eyes stricken. Weren't any of you just the least bit suspicious? Lelldorin seemed almost about to cry. It's such a good plan, he burst out finally. It couldn't help but succeed. That's what makes it so dangerous, Garion replied. Garion, what am I going to do? Lelldorin's voice was anguished. I don't think there's anything you can do right now, Garion told him. Maybe later, after we've had time to think about it, we'll come up with something. If we can't, we can always tell my grandfather about it. He'll think of a way to stop it. We can't tell anybody, Lelldorin reminded him. We're pledged to silence. We might have to break that pledge, Garion said somewhat reluctantly. I don't see that either of us owes that Murgo anything. But it's going to have to be up to you. I won't say anything to anybody without your permission. You decide, Lelldorin pleaded then. I can't do it, Garion. You're going to have to, Garion told him. I'm sure that if you think about it, you'll see why. I appreciate that they're having this conversation, and I appreciate that Garion is, he's being a little roundabout about things. He's not like, obviously, the quickest way to solve this problem would be to go straight to Mr. Wolf and Aunt Pole, or even to Silk, and tell them this is what's up. So that would be the most direct solution, but maybe not like the best way to keep his friend. And also maybe not the best way to keep his friend out of trouble. So I appreciate that Garion is saying, like, okay, obviously you can't go through with this plan. Let's come up with a solution to that. They reached the Great West Road then, and Barak led them south at a brisk trot, cutting off the possibility of further discussion. Pharma says absolutely, plus Lelldorin needs to learn how to take responsibility for things and ask for help, even when he's done something wrong. Yeah. Yeah, this does seem like an important thing for him to sort out. A league or so down the road, they passed a muddy village, a dozen or so turf-roofed huts with walls made of wattles plastered over with mud. If I'm not mistaken, I think wattles are like bundles of grass. So I think this is like, they've got turf roofs, grass walls plastered with mud. I think that's what wattles are. It's one of those, like, that's an obscure word that this is going to be the only time that word comes up for me in the next, like, 5 years, I'm sure. Wattles is how it's spelled. The fields around the village were dotted with tree stumps. Robot Kyo says, a construction of branches and twigs woven together to form a wall, barrier, fence, or roof. Okay, so not grass, it's branches and twigs. I can picture these houses. A dozen or so turf-roofed huts with walls made of wattles plastered over with mud. The fields around the village were dotted with tree stumps, and a few scrawny cows grazed near the edge of the forest. Ugh. I guess that's what like a turkey has, or a rooster. Yeah. Garion could not control his indignation as he looked at the misery implicit in the crude collection of hovels. Lelldorin, he said sharply, look. What? Where? The blond young man came out of his troubled preoccupation quickly, as if expecting some danger. The village, Garion told him. Look at it. It's only a serf's village, Lelldorin said indifferently. I've seen hundreds like it. He seemed ready to return to his own inner turmoil. Ah, yes, Farmhouse and Sharky is talking about Wattle and Daub. Right. I have definitely heard that before. Lelldorin seemed ready to return to his own inner turmoil. In Sandaria, we wouldn't keep pigs in places like that. Garion's voice rang with fervor. If only he could make his friend see. 2 ragged serfs were dispiritedly hacking chunks of firewood from one of the stumps near the road. As the party approached, they dropped their axes and bolted in terror for the forest. Does it make you proud, Lelldorin? Garion demanded. Does it make you feel good to know that your own countrymen are so afraid of you that they run from the very sight of you? Lelldorin looked baffled. They're serfs, Garion, he said as if that explained. They're men. They're not animals. Men deserve to be treated better. I can't do anything about it. They aren't my serfs. And with that, Lelldorin's attention turned inward again as he continued to struggle with the dilemma Garion had placed upon him. Ugh, that's a bit rough. Oh, Lelldorin. We're starting to get more and more of the Arendish society, the view of things. Only of the Asturian side so far, and of the Asturian view of Mimbrates. We haven't actually met any Mimbrates yet. Pharmo says, you just want to give him a little smack. Yeah. But the yeah, Asturian culture, we're starting to, I think, get an idea a little bit more of what that's like. By late afternoon, they had covered 10 leagues, and the cloudy sky was gradually darkening as evening approached. I think we are going to have to spend the night in the forest, Belgarath, Silk said, looking around. There's no chance of reaching the next Tolnedran hostel. Mr. Wolf had been half dozing in his saddle. It's not the first time we've caught Mr. Wolf dozing in the saddle. I feel like that goes back to early in Pawn of Prophecy when they took the trip to Upper Grault. I think even then Mr. Wolf kind of dozed on the cart. He looked up, blinking a bit. All right, he replied, but let's get back from the road a bit. Our fire could attract attention, and too many people know we're in Arendia already. There's a woodcutter's track right there, Dernick pointed at a break in the trees just ahead. It should lead us back into the trees. All right, Wolf agreed. The sound of their horses' hooves was muffled by the sodden leaves on the forest floor as they turned in among the trees to follow the narrow track. They rode silently for the better part of a mile, until a clearing opened ahead of them. How about here? Dernick asked. He indicated a brook trickling softly over mossy stones on one side of the clearing. That sounds nice. It will do, Wolf agreed. We're going to need shelter, the smith observed. I bought tents in Kamar, Silk told him. They're in the packs. That was foresighted of you, Aunt Pole complimented him. I've been in Arendia before, my lady. I'm familiar with the weather. Sounds a little bit like... The terrain sounds a little bit like Canada to me, you know, or at least British Columbia. Forests and damp. Maybe a little more fog than we usually get here. We do get some fog, but I guess it's probably supposed to be more like some countrysides in England, would be my guess. Garion and I'll go get wood for a fire then, Dernick said, climbing down from his horse and untying his axe from his saddle. I'll help you, Lelldorin offered, his face still troubled. Maybe I said that a little too cheerily then. Dernick nodded and led the way off into the trees. The woods were soaked, but the smith seemed to know almost instinctively where to find dry fuel. They worked quickly in the lowering twilight, and soon had 3 large bundles of limbs and faggots. They returned to the clearing where Silk and the others were erecting several dun-colored tents. Dernick dropped his wood and cleared a space for the fire with his foot. Then he knelt and began striking sparks with his knife from a piece of flint into a wad of dry tinder he always carried. In a short time, he had a small fire going, and Aunt Pole set out her pots beside it, humming softly to herself. Hettar came back from tending the horses, and they all stood back watching Aunt Pole prepare a supper from the stores Count Reldigan had pressed on them before they had left his house that morning. Yeah, I tried to just, knowing it meant a bundle of wood here, I tried to just continue on past it. So, I don't know. I'm not going to censor the book, and that's the meaning of the word. It's a bundle of wood, right? But that was definitely a moment of like, just read it and keep going. Hettar came back from tending the horses, and they all stood back watching Aunt Pole prepare a supper from the stores Count Reldigan had pressed on them before they had left his house that morning. After they had eaten, they sat around the fire talking quietly. "How far have we come today?" Dernick asked. 12 leagues, Hettar estimated. "How much farther do we have to go to get out of the forest?" "It's 80 leagues from Kamar to the central plain," Lelldorin replied. Dernick sighed. "A week or more. I'd hoped that it'd only be a few days."
"I know what you mean, Dernick,"
Barak agreed.
"It's gloomy under all these trees."
The horses, picketed near the brook, stirred uneasily. Hettar rose to his feet.
"Something wrong?"
Barak asked, also rising. "They shouldn't be," Hettar started. Then he stopped. "Back!" he snapped. "Away from the fire! The horses say there are men out there. Many, with weapons." He jumped back from the fire, drawing his saber. Lelldorin took one startled look at him and bolted for one of the tents. Garion's sudden disappointment in his friend was almost like a blow to the stomach. An arrow buzzed into the light and shattered on Barak's mail shirt.
"Arm yourselves!"
the big man roared, drawing his sword. Garion grasped Aunt Pole's sleeve and tried to pull her from the light. "Stop that!" she snapped, jerking her sleeve free. Another arrow whizzed out of the foggy woods. Aunt Pole flicked her hand as if brushing away a fly and muttered a single word. The arrow bounced back as if it had struck something solid and fell to the ground. I think that's our first instance of combat magic. Then, with a hoarse shout, a gang of rough, burly men burst from the edge of the trees and splashed across the brook, brandishing swords. As Barak and Hettar leaped forward to meet them, Lelldorin re-emerged from the tent with his bow and began loosing arrows so rapidly that his hands seemed to blur as they moved. Garion was instantly ashamed that he had doubted his friend's courage. With a choked cry, one of the attackers stumbled back, an arrow through his throat. Another doubled over sharply, clutching at his stomach, and fell to the ground, groaning. A third, quite young and with a pale, downy beard on his cheeks, dropped heavily and sat plucking at the feathers on the shaft protruding from his chest, with a bewildered expression on his boyish face. Then he sighed and slumped over on his side with a stream of blood coming from his nose. Sharkies say Lelldorin gets sneak attack if he's hiding in a tent. Lelldorin has rapid shot. The ragged-looking men faltered under the rain of Lelldorin's arrows, and then Barak and Hettar were upon them. With a great sweep, Barak's heavy sword shattered an upflung blade and crunched down into the angle between the neck and shoulder of the black-whiskered man who had held it. The man collapsed. Hettar made a quick feint with his saber, then ran it smoothly through the body of a pock-marked ruffian. The man stiffened, and a gush of bright blood burst from his mouth as Hetar pulled out his blade. Dernick ran forward with his axe, and Silk drew his long dagger from under his vest and ran directly at a man with a shaggy brown beard. At the last moment, he dived forward, rolled, and struck the bearded man full in the chest with both feet. Without pausing, he came up and ripped his dagger into his enemy's belly. The dagger made a wet, tearing sound as it sliced upwards, and the stricken man clutched at his stomach with a scream, trying to hold in the blue-colored loops and coils of his entrails that seemed to come boiling out through his fingers. Ugh, this is a nasty fight. Garion dived for the pax to get his own sword, but was suddenly grabbed roughly from behind. He struggled for an instant, then felt a stunning blow on the back of his head, and his eyes filled with a blinding flash of light.
This is the one we want,
a rough voice husked as Garion sank into unconsciousness. We've seen a couple other fights that, like there was the fight in Lelldorin, where there were the two Chereks stabbing each other. But even that, that was bloody, but it wasn't quite so descriptive, I think. He was being carried, that much was certain. He could feel the strong arms under him. He didn't know how long it had been since he had been struck on the head. His ears still rang, and he was more than a little sick to his stomach. He stayed limp, but carefully opened one eye. His vision was blurred and uncertain, but he could make out Barak's bearded face looming above him in the darkness, and merged with it, as once before in the snowy woods outside Lelldorin, he seemed to see the shaggy face of a great bear. He closed his eyes, shuddered, and started to struggle weakly.
It's all right, Garion,
Barak said, his voice sunk in a kind of despair.
It's me.
Garion opened his eyes again, and the bear seemed to be gone. He wasn't even sure he had ever really seen it.
Are you all right?
Barak asked, setting him on the ground. They hit me on the head, Garion mumbled, his hand going to the swelling behind his ear.
They won't do it again,
Barak muttered, his tone still despairing. Then the huge man sank to the ground and buried his face in his hands. It was dark and difficult to see, but it looked as if Barak's shoulders were shaking with a kind of terrible suppressed grief, a soundless, wrenching series of convulsive sobs. Where are we? Garion asked, looking around into the darkness. Barak coughed and wiped at his face.
Quite a ways from the tents. It took me a little while to catch up to the two who were carrying you off.
What happened? Garion was still a bit confused.
They're dead. Can you stand up?
I don't know. Garion tried to get up, but a wave of giddiness swept over him, and his stomach churned.
Never mind. I'll carry you,
Barak said in a now grimly practical voice. An owl screeched from a nearby tree, and its ghostly white shape drifted off through the trees ahead of them. As Barak lifted him, Garion closed his eyes and concentrated on keeping his stomach under control. Before long, they came out into the clearing and its circle of firelight. Is he all right? Aunt Pole asked, looking up from bandaging a cut on Dernick's arm.
A bump on the head is all,
Barak replied, setting Garion down.
Did you run them off?
His voice was harsh, even brutal. Those that could still run, Silk answered, his voice a bit excited, and his ferret eyes bright. They left a few behind. He pointed at a number of still shapes lying near the edge of the firelight. Lelldorin came back into the clearing, looking over his shoulder with his bow half drawn. He was out of breath, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" he asked as soon as he saw Geryon. Geryon nodded, gently fingering the lump behind his ear. "I tried to find the two who took you," the young man declared, "but they were too quick for me. There's some kind of animal out there. I heard it growling while I was looking for you. Awful growls."
"The beast is gone now,"
Barak told him flatly. "What's the matter with you?" Silk asked the big man.
"Nothing."
"Who were these men?" Geryon asked. "Robbers, most likely," Silk surmised, putting away his dagger. "It's one of the benefits of a society that holds men in serfdom. They get bored with being serfs and go out into the forest looking for excitement and profit." "You sound just like Geryon," Lelldorin objected. "Can't you people understand that serfdom's part of the natural order of things here? Our serfs couldn't take care of themselves alone, so those of us in higher station accept the responsibility of caring for them." "Of course you do," Silk agreed sarcastically. "They're not so well fed as your pigs, nor as well kenneled as your dogs, but you do care for them, don't you?" "That'll do, Silk," Aunt Pole said coolly. "Let's not start bickering among ourselves." She tied a last knot on Dernick's bandage and came over to examine Geryon's head. She touched her fingers gently to the lump, and he winced. "It doesn't seem too serious," she observed. "It hurts all the same," he complained. "Of course it does, dear," she said calmly. She dipped a cloth in a pail of cold water and held it to the lump. "You're going to have to learn to protect your head, Geryon. If you keep banging it like this, you're going to soften your brains." Can't argue with that. Geryon has been hit on the head a few times by this point. Farmo says he needs a helmet. Geryon was about to answer that, but Hetar and Mr. Wolf came back into the firelight just then. "They're still running," Hetar announced. The steel discs on his horsehide jacket gleamed red in the flickering light, and his saber was streaked with blood.
"They seem to be awfully good at that part of it," Wolf said. "Is everyone all right?"
"A few bumps and bruises is about all," Aunt Pole told him. "It could have been much worse."
"Let's not start worrying about what could have been." "Shall we remove those?"
Barak growled, pointing at the bodies littering the ground near the brook. "Shouldn't they be buried?" Dernick asked. His voice shook a little, and his face was very pale.
"Too much trouble,"
Barak said bluntly.
"Their friends can come back later and take care of it, if they feel like it."
"Isn't that just a little uncivilized?" Dernick objected. Barak shrugged.
"It's customary."
Mr. Wolf rolled one of the bodies over and carefully examined the dead man's gray face.
"Looks like an ordinary Arendish outlaw," he grunted. "It's hard to say for sure, though."
Lelldorin was retrieving his arrows, carefully pulling them out of the bodies.
"Let's drag them all over there a ways,"
Barak said to Hetar.
"I'm getting tired of looking at them."
Dernick looked away, and Geryon saw 2 great tears standing in his eyes. "Does it hurt, Dernick?" he asked sympathetically, sitting on the log beside his friend. "I killed one of those men, Geryon," the smith replied in a shaking voice. I hit him in the face with my axe. He screamed, and his blood splashed all over me. Then he fell down and kicked on the ground with his heels until he died. You didn't have any choice, Dernick, Garion told him. They were trying to kill us. I've never killed anyone before, Dernick said, the tears now running down his face. He kicked the ground for such a long time. Such a terribly long time. Why don't you go to bed, Garion? Aunt Pole suggested firmly. Her eyes were on Dernick's tear-streaked face. Garion understood. Good night, Dernick, he said. He got up and started toward one of the tents. He glanced back once. Aunt Pole had seated herself on the log beside the smith and was speaking quietly to him with one of her arms comfortingly about his shoulders. And that's the end of chapter 4 on page 53. Yeah, there have been fights before, and I mean, even with this group, there have been some fights, but we didn't get much of a description of those ones because Garion wasn't near like the core of the fighting, and I don't think any of the previous fights with this group were super bloody. The battle in Val Elorn was very bloody, but again, Garion only saw part of it, and we didn't see any of his group of friends fighting. And I feel like, you know, this felt a little bit like a random encounter in D&D, as everybody's kind of commenting in the chat. You know, robbers appear, you fight, they die, you live, everything's good. But it was very descriptive in a few different ways, right? Like that downy-faced young man with the arrow, you know, looks at it and just kind of flumps over, and you're like, wow, he was just a kid. Or the guy that Silk killed and his entrails coming out. That was more brutal than just about anything I think we've encountered. And then you've got Dernick at the end and how he's handling it. So I think that this sort of drove home a little bit how, you know, a fight isn't just a fight when you've got deadly weapons in hand. Sharky say Garion obviously has a cushion, and Dernick now probably has some PTSD. Yeah, like they say, poor Dernick. That yeah. And like Garion said, you know, he didn't have a choice. They were under attack. Like, these people started off by shooting arrows into their camp. Any one of those could have been lethal for anyone in their party. But yeah, that was definitely a rough bit. And again, like, I mean, now we did have clearly these robbers were after Garion, so obviously they were sent there. But we are getting, again, more Asturian society. We've got Lelldorin objecting, like, this is just the natural order of things here, and Silk commenting on that side of things. Sharky say, good job on the horse's part, though. I imagine if the story centered more on Hetar, we would get more horse dialogue. Yeah, sadly, I think we only ever speak to the horses through Hetar, since this story is basically just from Garion's point of view, right? But that is interesting, isn't it? That they were alerted to the attack in the first place by the horses saying there are men out there with weapons, and Hetar got that directly from the horses. So that's an interesting bit, and we also got, you know, Hetar and Lelldorin both showing their worth. Like, the beginning of the fight, Lelldorin just immediately took out 3 of their attackers or more. Farmo says, but not from the horses' mouths. Oh, boy. I feel like I encourage this, don't I?
Oh, somebody followed my channel within this past hour. Hello to Gigiwan or Gigiwan, I don't know. I don't see them in the chat, it just says they followed the channel. Alright. So yeah, a little bit of action at the end there. Nobody yet has really commented on how they carried Garion off. I guess they're all getting kind of used to that. Garion's getting carried off like every, I don't know, I'd say like once every 10 chapters, Garion gets stolen. And Garion hasn't said anything about how they were after him, but he heard that while, like after he'd been struck on the head. So he definitely tends to forget bits of information like that, usually because he's been struck on the head. Yeah, he's making that a habit. We'll see. Pharma says, ha ha, brain damage. We'll see. We'll see whether Garion learns to take better care of himself as things progress. Pharma says, yay, I even said it how you were thinking. Oh boy. Sharky's like Aunt Pole's warning about getting soft brains. Harry Birdman style. Cookies on dowels. So, we're getting more of a look at Lelldorin specifically's personality, I feel like, in these chapters. You know, in his first chapter, he showed up. He was very brash. You know, some men are hunting royal game, and I'll help you kill the enemy who killed your parents, and all that. And then I spit on Natchak's oath, and then Garion explaining how maybe this plan isn't in their best interests. And then Lelldorin being conflicted about that. So we've got him at least willing to listen to reason. He's not sure what to do with that information yet. But then we've also got his outlook on serfs, which is very gross. I don't know. So Lelldorin, I feel like, is a complicated character. He's definitely like a... like, he reminds me of Romeo. You know? He sets his objective on something and he's willing to slice his way through to obtain that, and like, yeah, like that like emotional, let's just charge in headlong to things kind of personality without thinking about right or wrong so much. Marmo says, do you think that maybe regicide might be a bad idea? Especially, and this is just me spitballing, when it comes from a Murgo? Sharky say, not quite the Lelldorin we all saw at first. Yeah, he's got some things to work out for sure. Oh boy. All right. Well, it's 8:34. I'm getting pretty hungry. I'm gonna go eat some leftover satay lamb on vermicelli from Memory Corner with greens. It's very tasty. If you ever have a chance to go to Memory Corner in Richmond, it's a Taiwanese restaurant, and I really like their satay lamb on vermicelli. So I've got leftovers from, because yesterday I got to go back to Kung Fu for the first time this year, which was quite nice. Worked up a sweat, went through a couple of forms and things. Yeah. And Farmos has 3-cup chicken stew from Memory Corner, and had a like banana milk slush, and I had a honeydew slush along with my vermicelli, which was also pretty good. A very like mild taste. I know some people don't like honeydew, but I do. Um, yeah, a mild taste, but it was good. It was a little creamy. Yeah, so I'm gonna eat that, and I have with me a coffee because I'm not gonna sleep tonight because I need to get my sleep schedule fixed, and the only real way I know how to do that is to stay up all night and then fall asleep at a reasonable time tomorrow. It's not a perfect solution. Tomorrow's not going to be very much fun for me, but I don't know any better way of doing it. Sharky say, heard the pronunciation online. It's more like Lelldorin. Is that not what I've been saying? Lelldorin. 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 That's what's different. I feel like I'm saying it right, and everybody's hearing Lildorin, and I'm saying Lelldorin. Lelldorin. Oh. Give me such a hard time. I don't deserve this. Lelldurin. What? Lelldurin? Lelldurin? You typed out door. Lelldurin. Well, I don't know if there's a way of knowing what way is correct unless David Eddings at some point said out loud the character's name. So you think it shouldn't be door, it should be dur. Like trying to pronounce the name of some planet. Yeah, that was an interesting thing. The series of books, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, have in the back of the books, I guess, sort of appendices that tell you how to pronounce a variety of things. And like tell you about like who some of the characters are and things like that. Well, this is actually just, yeah, it's got a list of characters that say who they are, and then there's a guide to pronunciation. Look at that right there. And that's something that's interesting. I think I didn't know it was there when I read the first book until I got to the back of the book and I was like, oh, this would have been useful. And there's also like translations for some of the things, like if people say things in different languages in the book, it doesn't get translated when they say it, but the translation for it is here in the back of the book. So, if somebody says in Rimmerspak, vad es, ufnamen hot vad es, it means, what in the name of God, what? So that's an interesting thing about these books. And then, yeah, there's like, it gives you examples of things, but it'll be like, in Erkenlandish, old Erkenlandish names should be pronounced like modern English, except as follows. A is always a, as in father. AE is as in like say, like, so AE is A. C is always pronounced with a hard K, as in keen. So that's another interesting thing there. Farmos asks, do they have a guide for puppy's name? Not in the book that I'm holding, I don't think. Maybe, let me check. Canuck. Troll language is considerably different than the other human languages. There are 3 hard K sounds, signified by C, Q, and K. The only difference intelligible to most non-Canuck is a slight clucking sound on the Q, but it is not to be encouraged in beginners. For our purposes,
All three will sound with the K of keep. Also, the Canuck U is pronounced as in bug. Other interpretations are up to the reader, but he or she will not go far wrong pronouncing phonetically. So, I don't think it changes puppy name. In Greek, it's actually more like Oranos. 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 But yeah, that was something that's interesting about these books. I don't know if I'll ever suggest, like, I love these books, but they're pretty heavy duty. This is book, I think, 3 of 4, because, or actually, no, this is probably the entirety of 2 Green Angel Tower. Yeah, because this is the hardback. I don't think I've ever actually read this hardback. I've only ever read this book in softcover where it's divided in 2, so to Green Angel Tower Part 1 and 2. So in that case, it's 4 books, but if you've just got it like this, then technically this is book 3 of 3. Very good series, but very grim. It has some dark moments. It's got some great parts. And, you know, like our dog is named after a character from this book. Excuse me. I love the art on the back of these characters. I love that shield. It's so neat looking. There, focused. But yeah, they're long books and quite serious and some kind of heavy subject matter at times. So I don't know that I'll want to read them on the stream for that reason. Like, I do, yeah, I love the books, but I don't know if they'd be too grim, too bard-like. But that said, if you're looking for a good fantasy read, I would highly recommend them. All right. Well, I'm going to go eat some leftovers, like I said earlier. So I hope everyone has a great weekend. I should call the pup. I should call Binabik. I should call Binbinakekabinik. Binbinakekabinik. Binabon Bean. Binbinakekabon Bean. Look at that puppy. Oh, hello again, Lily. Enjoy leftovers, thank you. Come say goodbye to everyone, Bin. As he's just on the bottom of the frame, sorry about that. You're just lurking. Well, I'm just ending. Does anybody, let's see. You got a, Bin and Bahai. Got any suggestion to raid out to, Lily? He is a good puppy. Look at him. Hey, good pup? You good boy? Waggy your tail? Wag, wag, wag. No? I don't want to wag her. Oh, he's got an itch. Scratch, 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 scratch. Farmer says, oh yes, happy Valentine's Day. Yeah, in what, 3 days, right? For a brief second, I was like, it's not the 14th today. I didn't miss something, did I? Today's the 11th. But yes, we will not see anybody again until after Valentine's Day for this stream. Alright. Well, I'm going to wrap things up. So, have a good night, everybody. See you next Wednesday. We'll get on to Chapter 5. Read some Chaucer. No, thank you. Bye.